The first part of the Maamar seems to be an arichis before the Rebbe actually gets to Perik Tezayin, which is, in this version, Sif Gimel. There's a whole arichis here about Atzishitim, Niskafia, all the first prokim. And then interestingly in Sif Beis, the Rebbe goes into Avodas HaTshuva and Avodas HaSimcha. It's not so clear why all of a sudden the Rebbe goes into this whole thing about Simcha. And then, after all of that, there the Rebbe starts about the Oitz and goes into Perik Tezayin. So it seems that the Rebbe's putting a yesod in the first few prokim. So, the Yisvai is, the Rebbe is bringing in Avodah the two inyonim of Maila and Mata, how it translates itself into Avodah. So let's first jump into Perik Gimel, and we'll see how this all fits together, the two inyonim of Maila Mata. Okay, so the Lashon over here in Perik Gimel is a little bit not so clear. Let's learn just a few lines inside. Perik Gimel. V'hine b'Perik Tezayin shel hemshech ha'ilula, mamshech levai inyan oiren sof l'mayla mayla adin ketz l'matamat adin tachlis. U'mechadish. T'shnei inyonim elu heim ba'oisei oir. In the same oir you have l'mayla and l'mata. And then, v'hine b'chlolos inyan l'mayla adin ketz heim oiris makifim l'mata adin tachlis is oiris pnimiyim. U'b'Perik zeh mechadish u'moisev u'mavayr u'mafaret. This is actually the Lashon of the Rebbe. Is mechadish u'moisev u'mavayr u'mafaret shegam ba'oiris makifim atzmam yeshnom beis ha'inyonim de l'mayla adin ketz l'mata adin tachlis, which are the Makiv HaKodev, Makiv HaRochi, Makiv HaYochez, Makiv HaYosha, etc. Then he connects it with Keseh and continues from there. So, what is Taka the Rebbe saying? That here the Rebbe is giving out the Nekuda of the Maamar. What's the Chidush of Perik Tezayin? If you remember in Tavshin Chavov we had a whole diyun that how do we learn the beginning of Tavshin Chavov? It says Oiren Sof L'Maylo L'Mata. How can you say Maylo L'Mata in Oiren Sof? What was the teretz up until Perik Tezayin in the Hemshech? The Maylo L'Mata is not going on Oiren Sof. It's the places where the oil goes. The oil goes all the way to Maila and it goes all the way to Mata. Now the Rebbe is saying, "U'machadish t'shnei inyonim elu heim ba'oisei oil," which b'pashtus means that in oil, the same as Tavshin Chavov, that in oil and Sof Gufa, you have two madregas of Maila Mata. What is Taka the big chiddush to say that there's two madregas of Maila Mata in oil and Sof? This is, although the Rebbe speaks about Arichas Tavshin Chavov, but what's the big deal that there's two madregas in Oil and Sof? What's the big chiddush about there? Till now we were talking about Mayla Mata by from Klali, that Oil and Sof goes up and Oil and Sof goes down. Now we're saying no, but in Oil and Sof, Lifnei Atzim Gufa, there's two madregas. The Rebbe's madgish here that there's a big chiddush. Mechadush u'moisev u'mavaya mefaret, four Lashonos. What's the big deal that there's two madregas in Oil and Sof? In the same oil. Now, there happens to be that there was a Ksav Yad, which you probably have in the Kuntras. There was a Ksav Yad that came out, two Kisvei Yodas that came out, which I think go to the heart of the whole Maamar. You have the, you know what I'm talking about? The two Kisvei Yodas. They had different questions. The Manichim had different questions on what the Rebbe meant. And just by the Rebbe answering the question, he says, the yesod of the whole Maamar. It's not in the, I don't know if it's in this country, it's in the blue ones. The ones with the blue cover. I'll read you out the Lashon, the piece which is Negea. One Ksav Yad, the Rebbe is answering a question that they had. Their question was that the Rebbe seems to be saying, this madrega is called Makiv D'Oyosha, and this madrega is called Makiv D'Oycheza, and over there it says differently, and they were asking like it didn't seem to stim. So the Rebbe says, what I'm trying to say is Adarabba. the Lashon here is Shebechol, underline, Shebechol hadargis ish beis hanal. V'yesh drushim hamadabrim bebir darga mesuyemes, v'yeshnom shebedarga klolis yesa, oi bechol hadargas. And then in another Savyad on a different question, the Rebbe writes a similar Lashon, V'shnehem yeshnom beis hamakifim, v'tolui hamaduba biprati yesa. So what we find over here is the Rebbe is basically giving us a yesod in the whole Perek, in the whole inyan of Ma'ilo Mata. When we were learning before Oren Sof is L'Ma'ilo in the case of Mata and Tachlis, we were learning that these are directions that Oren Sof goes. But Oyer itself, what is Oyer itself? Is it one inyan? It just goes different directions? When we or we're just saying, yeah, it goes. It's one Oyer, but there's a few madregas in Oyer. The Rebbe is saying no. Whenever you come to Oyer Sof, what is the taich? Oyer Sof L'Mayla in the case of Mata and Tachlis means every level of Oyer Sof is split into two, Maila and Mata. So wherever you're going to go, Lifnei Tzimtzum, you're going to find Ma'ilo Mata. Lachar Tzimtzum, you're going to find Ma'ilo Mata. Down here in Olam Hazeh, you're going to find Ma'ilo Mata. And not Ma'ilo Mata just the way it talks about in other places, that Ma'ilo is going to be Soviv, and Mata is going to be Mamala. This is Makif, and this is Plimi. In Makifim, you're also going to be split up. In Oyer and Sof itself, but Oysei Oyer, in the Mzelben Oyer, the Lashon, if I remember from the tape, in the Mzelben Oyer, in the same Oyer, you have two things, Ma'ilo and Mata. And the Rebbe then continues with the moshel of the Talmud, the Rav and Talmud, which it seems that what the Rebbe is saying is that if you look in the moshel of the Rav and Talmud and you stretch it out to the fullest, you will see that on every level the moshel is mechuven, because on every level of the Rav and the Talmud you're going to find two things, Ma'ilo Mata. And that's why when they were asking a question, you said this madrega belongs to the Rav and this madrega belongs to the Talmud. They're having questions, and the Rebbe says, Adarabba, I'm saying that wherever you go, you're going to find the two. Some Maamarim only speak about a certain thing. They call this Makif HaRochik, and this is called Makif HaKorev. I'm saying, says the Rebbe, I'm not being kevei, I'm just telling you, wherever you're going to go, you're going to find two inyanim. Which means to say like this. It's another, another emphasis on what the Rebbe was talking about in Chavov, but slightly differently. If you remember in Tosha Chavov, the Rebbe was bringing down from the Alter Rebbe that how could there be Bichlal Madregas in Oyer and Sof? And what was the answer? The general answer is that since Oyer is a Ha'ara, and Ha'ara ain't by min ha'etzem, it's only a Ha'ara, Etzem obviously doesn't have Madregas. Ha'ara is not Etzem. So Ha'ara is allowed to have Madregas. It could be, it's Taka Oyer and Sof, but it's not an Etzem, therefore you can have Madregas. The Rebbe is saying, Ki'ilu, the Rebbe is saying over here, by default, if it's Oirs, must have Madregas. And just by using by way of an example, Agam the Rebbe doesn't bring it in the mind, but just to give an example, you have by Matan Torah it says, Achas diber lekim, shtaim zu shamoiti. The Rebbe said one thing, and I heard two. For example, you have Zachav v'shamoit b'diber echad. And the Rebbe Taka brings at the beginning of the Maamar that by Shas Matan Torah, the Torah was given in two kavim. That's where we go back to the first part of the Maamar. Look in, it's going to be Sif, where does he tell us about? Yes, in Sif Aleph, on page Lamed, he says, let's go 4 lines down. He's talking about the Hamshach and the Mishkan started out with Moshe. In other words, everything starts out with Matan Torah. It's Yesh Shloimeh. The zel mashib Matan Torah nitnu beis oifane avei desumar avasei tov ukenoida shadiba onoichi kol kol mitzvasei adiba lo yilacha kol mitzvos lo yisasei. So the whole Maamar is bringing it now in avoid, and this is the part of the avoida where he's saying it starts off with Oyer and Sof. It starts off with Oyer and Sof. The Rebbe went first to avoid and then went to Oyer and Sof. That's the Shoresh. Now let's go backwards now. The Shoresh is in Oyer and Sof. If it's Oyer and Sof, it's already not Etzem. It by default has two inyanim. It has Maila or Mata, which is, let's put it into different words and makes it more easy to understand. It has Chiyuv and Shlili. What's the difference between Maila and Mata? Maila is Loi Lahoyer, to go upwards and backwards and not to be Meir. That's also a level of Oyer, an Oyer which goes backwards. What's touch Oyer Chayzer? It's not touched in the Maamar. It was very hard finding a mocker for this. Oyer chayzer means an oyer which is chayzer backwards. What's a dugma of oyer chayzer? Where do we find oyer chayzer? What mashal do we usually use for oyer chayzer? What's the general mashal we use? A Talmud who asks a question to the Rav, it's called oyer chayzer. Right? The difference between Bavli and Shami, Bavli is full of questions because it's oyer chayzer. What's oyer chayzer? Because when you ask somebody a question, what happens is he has to be chayzer back inside and rethink his previous statement. How could you say such a thing? Tosfos comes along and says, Ve'im taima, how could you say such a thing? There it says differently. Oh, so you're going to have to go backwards, chayzer, back into the seichel, and find out a new way of thinking. Whereas Rashi doesn't tell you any kashas. He just goes oyer yashri, tells you as it is. So oyer chayzer means he forces you to go back inwards. So an oyer which is called a machiv oyer chayzer means it's a type of oyer which is chayzer la'atzma. It's reflexive. It goes back into itself and stays there. That's why it's sosan be'etzem. So loy saseh is that tnuah of loy lahoy, not to be meir, but to go back into self. So when the oil comes down, it's lahoy, that's called the mata. When the oil goes backwards, loy lahoy, it's going back to be makif and stay above and aloof and not come down. So oil chayzer, loy saseh, and loy lahoy is all inyanim of shlila. In avodah, that would be a mitzvah loy saseh. So basically, the Rebbe is saying over here, in avodah sa'odam, you have mitzvah saseh, mitzvah loy saseh, because by Matan Torah, that's how the Torah was given. It was given lechatchila in two kavim. Anoichi v'lo yeh, that's the whole Torah. Anoichi is the shirish of all mitzvahs aseh, lo yeh is the shirish of all mitzvahs lo aseh, and this is how the Torah was given. That's how it started off, and therefore everything after that it falls in those two lines. And that will explain to us also Sif base. You get what I'm saying? So far so good, right? The shirish is that oil is by default mechulik to two. It's one oil. It's one coin with two sides. It's one oil that has Maila Amata. Why? How does it have? Because it's an oil. The very fact it's an oil, it comes out lachatchila, that it can be done this way or that way. Even though it's coming from an etzem echad, which is yochid and meyuchid, but when it comes out as a gilui is only a ha'ara, and a ha'ara by default must have. I'm going to give you an example of something you learned in 9 base, if you remember, that might give you an example. It says, we learned 9 base, that there's Eses Firis Agnosis, right? Eses Firis Agnosis. How do you get to Eses Firis Agnosis? All the Brit said it should be Esa. That's how they came into Esa. What's higher, a higher level in Eir and Sof, where there's no Esa? It's no Maila Me'alei Saratzen. How many spheres are there? We say spheres 8 kates. What? The sphere is 1, 2, 3, 4, up until 8 kates? What's the spheres 8 kates? So it says clearly, it doesn't mean that there are spheres which you can count, each one, up until 8 kates. It means that mitzad the fact that the oil is an oil poshut, therefore it can be nisbaya, it can be nisgala in blig v'lefanim. The very fact that it's a gilui is already, how can you express a gilui? Bligful ways. It incorporates blig v'lefanim, so the spheres 8 kates. Spheres is Miloshon L'saper. How many ways, what could it tell you, Oyer and Sof? It could tell you Blik Vulinyanim. So it's spheres 8 kates. Here we're doing it into 2. Not 8 kates, but the same idea. If it's an Oyer, you're going to ask, so what type of Oyer is it? It's this way or that way. It has L'chatchila, it's expressible in 2 ways. Either his galus or Helam. Those are the 2 ways, chronistic ways. We're talking about spheres now, going back to the original thing. Or has it either it was nisgala or it's not nisgala. Either it's lahoy or shloi lahoy. So automatically oil splits itself into 2. Achas dibelikim, shtaim zu shamoiti. Now, so the same thing.
This you said like because of this in general that whenever we're going to speak about anything after it's always split. Only it is also kelim.
Kelim already lachatchila mugdarim. I don't know if you can do that with kelim. We're talking about an oil, which is an oil poshut. Memele, it can be nisgala in all different ways.
So this idea that there's both makif and pnimi, so you have that in kelim.
From that comes different levels of makifim. A makif of oil chayzer will be an oil which the emphasizes it's not being nisgala. It's a loy lahoya, so it's going to be steamers. What's that?
Kelim also there's idea makif and pnimi, no?
Makif and Kalim? Kalim are Makablim. But anyway, we're not talking about Kalim over here anyhow, we're talking about oil.
And in Iskafia Sabcha translates also as
we're going to get to that in a second. So, the Sheirish is that oil is Mechulet to Lahoy and Shloi Lahoy, which is Maila Mata, which is either Makif and Pnimi, or in Makif and Gufa, Makif Dari Chayz, Makif Dari Yasha. It's always going to be split into two. And you're going to find that in the whole Seder Dach, so he brings it further on, you find it in Kesser. Kesser is going to be split into two. It's one Sphira, one Olam called Kesser. It's going to be split into two, Atik and Arich. And the marshal down here, is going to be Bais and Avushal. Now, what is it in Avodah? So again, going back to Sif Aleph and Beis, in Avodah it's Mitzvah Saseh, Mitzvah Leisaseh, which is, what's in Avodah Sa'odom, the theme that keeps on repeating itself in the Hemshech of Basi Legani. It seems this is what one of the things that everyone wants to add on with the whole Sif Beis. When you learn Basi Legani, it's a klotz kasha I've had for years. Learn Basi Legani, Tavshin Yud. What's the whole thing you see? Also, you make this Shanta Beseich, and Beseich, Leina, but Beseich, Lechen, Vechot. Here in you, and Tachas, I want to be a Saidim, Mrs. Havas, I could have been Bertainim, Alida avoided this Skafi, this Habch. And he goes on and starts going on about what his Skafi does, and a Skafi, maybe the is Habch. When the whole Hemshech is talking about a Skafi, what happened to just regular Torah mitzvahs? Does that do the Mishkan as well? Or is it only Iskafia, Shtus, Skafia? What happened to regular Torah mitzvahs? Like Tefillin? That doesn't do the Mishkan. So I'm sure you can find a Iskafia in Tefillin, or Choesin or Mezuzah. I don't know, somehow you can find this. It seems to be some Miftzeh Iskafia, and the Torah mitzvahs seem to be. So it seems that in the Hemshech itself, obviously the Dogish is on Iskafia, but why is the Dogish on Iskafia? Because he wants to say the word of Atzeshitim. Means obviously we're talking about Torah mitzvahs generally, but there's a shtus involved in Torah mitzvahs. There's a lamaylim emedida v'hagval. What's a shtus? A shtus means going out of your boundaries and doing more than you off the beaten track. You're going off more than usual. So when does that usually happen? Atzeshitim was talking about changing shtus to lomazeh, which is usually in yonim which are connected with loisaseh. And you're supposed to push it to the other way and do iskafia and do shtus to kedusha. So the main emphasis seems to be taki iskafia, but there could be the same thing in that whole kav of iskafia is which kav? The lo yirlecha, the kav of shlila, the kav of loy lahoy. How about let's find the iskafia l'mayla yusa, not the negatives being shayl or something bad. Let's take the whole iskafia with the whole shtus and put it into something chiyuvi, just like the Rebbe did in the first Maamar, by the way. What was the shtus to kedusha in the first Maamar? A bunch of stories of the Rabbi Seinu, where they did obviously saw an of the there was a shtus. Well, we stopped in the middle of davening Yom Kippur to chop down a tree to make somebody some soup. What are you doing? The Alter Rebbe of all people? And the Rebbe said it was on Yom Kippur. Elamai, shtus to kedusha. If this is what's monsich, we're going to do it. Doesn't make sense, but you do it. And I'll do all the other shipurim. So you find the inyan of shtus in an inyan chiyuvi, and that's what the Rebbe wants to find an avodah klali, not just one case of Avos Yisrael, an avodah klalis where you find the same type of, just like you have a milchama gedola in iskafia, find me the same thing in a positive way. What positive mitzvah, what positive anhaga, which is not talking about just plain Torah mitzvahs, because we said before, obviously Basi Legani is talking about doing Torah mitzvahs. He's talking about the oifen of kiyum of Torah mitzvahs. The oifen of kiyum Torah mitzvahs is kafia. Shtus de lomazeh. Shtus de kedusha connected to lomazeh. Find me now not in iskafia of something negative, find me in something positive, an avodah which is similar to iskafia, in the kav hachiyuvi, in the positive. So here comes Perik Beis. Perik Beis, he says, "Ve'ina avodah do yisrael shinenu avodah satruva bo alidei milchama g'dayla." So that's still on the kav of milchamas, fighting against something. V'al pizeh yesh levaya. How'd you get to al pizeh? But now we understand. Al pizeh that what? Al pizeh that we said that Torah was given in two kavim. There's the kav hachiv and the kav shlili. So let's find it now in the kav shlili. Is yesh levai masher kosav Rambam shas simcha. She yismach on basis amitzvah avodah gedolah here. So it's a play on the words gdolah. There's milchama gdolah. Now we've got avodah gedolah. That was a negative, and this is a positive. Shenem atachas hashalevat Hashem ekechem simcha tuvrevov. And then he goes and describes it. You find the Rambam says, David mefazes umcharker b'chol oiz. So what's the whole vod? It doesn't seem to make sense. If you learn it straight, as it's written here, or as it, even the way the Rebbe said it, doesn't. So you found an Avodah Gedolah. It sounds like a play on words. Milchama Gedolah, Avodah Gedolah. What are you saying? What is the point? But if you see that in the Yesod, what's the Yesod? Which he's going to say later time. The Yesod is, and over here, Bekitza, that the Yesod is that Torah was given in both kavim. And B'shor Shalamayla, that means oil, automatically has two kavim, Chiv and Shlila. So in Avodah Sa'odam, it's Anoichi V'layir L'cha. So therefore, in the Oifen HaAvodah, is also both kavim. So the Oifen HaAvodah, which is L'mayla Medida V'Hagbala, which would include Iskafia, would also include Shuvah, that's what he spoke earlier, and in the Tzad HaChiyuvi, that would include Simcha. That's a positive. It's an Iskafia L'mayliusa. It's a different type of Iskafia. To be B'Simcha L'mayla Medida V'Hagbala. That is the Nakuda of the Maamar. It seems.
What's the word by the HV says the Talmud should simply say the Gdela.
What's that? Where are you reading from?
In base, the end of the first Sugrai. The Talmud should simply say the Gdela became into some Shimacham Gdela.
End of Sif base? I don't have.
In Sif base, like 8 lines into the paragraph. After he finishes speaking. Yes, right after that.
So, what's the problem? You've got to have both kavim equally, just like you have in the Milchama Gedolah. You've got to have the Tzara Chiyuvi, which is the Simcha Gedolah. Okay, so that's the general Nakuda of the Maamar. Then when the Rebbe gets back to the Moshel of the Rav and Talmud, so there's a Sif here, Sif Dala, which starts off with Yuvan, and there's a star which goes on to Sif Zer Hoya Lamara Enik Vedic Zadma. I don't know what that means. Does that mean the Rebbe agrees with the way it's written? It seems so it's like a Chatzi Muga, a Shlish Muga. I'm not sure how you're supposed to understand that Sif, but it seems what the Teichen is to find in the Moshel that in every stage of the game, every stage of the Moshel, of the Rav and the Talmud, you're always going to find Maila and Mata. And that's why he goes into the Arichas from the Ayin base, and that's all miyusad on the same Nakuda, that everything splits itself into two. So wherever you're going to go, you're going to find the two things. And the reason why he's bringing this Moshel, Taka, in this Maamar, why is the Rebbe going to bring this Moshel, the way the Rebbe is being Masbeh now, because this Moshel is the best Moshel that brings out this Nakuda, that every stage of Ishtalshlus is always going to have two Kavim, which is Maila and Mata. Which in Avodah Sa'odam is, again, which is Loisa Asa Mitzvah, and in the Ofen HaAvodah that would mean Iskafia or Simcha. Now, this is the last chance, right? So we're just going to quickly skip over to the next Maamar, which I find a fascinating Maamar. It's a very unusual Maamar, because where do you have a Maamar being via the Inyan of the Baal Shem Tov and the Inyan of the Mizit Shemagid? I remember the Maamar came out, what the Rebbe was saying, that was very nice. The Rebbe was talking about the Magid and the Baal Shem Tov. But it's also a Tosfos beer in the whole Inyan of the Moshel. A Tosfos beer in the whole Inyan of the Moshel, because when the Rebbe chazes over the Nakuda of the Maamar, right, it's on page Lamed Vav, Lamed Zayin. So he starts here with it's a hemshech, right? We have Matitza Kelai, and on the next page he says, he goes into the Bizbuz Ha'otzros. not so clear why he has to go and chazer over things which we know about already. The bizvus ha'otzros, that if it's something that's worthwhile, it's a cheshbon, he wouldn't be mevazvus. But if it's something l'mayla, if it's netzach, he's going to be mevazvus the otzros. Then he goes into lahovan inyan ha'otzros l'mayla, and he repeats a nekuda from the previous Maamar. And then he adds on just a one-liner. Right at the end of the page, page Lamed Zayin, right at the end of the page, in the middle of Sif Beis, the last line of the page, he says, let's read what he says, V'nispay le'el achidush bazer, shegam ba'oisa oir atzma yesh beis madregas. Right, that we spoke about just now. Ma she'oir zeu l'mayla neketz, she'oir l'mayla mayla b'yicha al'il, helem achahelem ad in ketz, v'oisa oir l'mata in tachlis, she'nimshach v'diri. This is obviously written, obviously not written correctly, because that wasn't the chiddush of the previous Maamar. There's obviously something missing. We said that was the beer up until Perek Tezayin. So there's something wrong over there. But this is the line that interests me the most. The last line. He said, "Umitzad ha'etzem beis kavim elu hem b'shova." This is a hisofa which the Rebbe didn't say before. So, I'll just get straight to the Nekuda. What is the Rebbe adding on by repeating this whole thing about the bizbus ha'otzros, and then this one line, Umitzad ha'etzem beis kavim elu hem b'shova. So the Rebbe is basically saying like this. If you want to explain to someone the madrega of oitza, which is the etzem ha'or, how do you do that? You explain that L'mayla, there's lifnei atzimtzum, there's a few madregas, and one of them is etzem ha'or. That's sasum ba'etzem. We don't find that. In Basi Legani, we find the Fidiker first starts off with the Maamar Azal, oir and sof l'mayla, the case of mata din tachlis. Goes an arichas g'doyle to explain it, and then by Perek Tezayin, all of a sudden tells us that in oir and sof gufa there's two madregas of l'mayla l'mata, and the highest of them is going to be the etzem ha'or. Why did you need this whole arichas to explain the Maamar Azal of the Zohar? There's nothing wrong with doing it. It's not a kasha, but there's a system over here. He's being mayrich in being mavaya the Maamar Azal of Tikkun Zohar, oir and sof l'mayla. You find in other hemsheichem, let's say, where's the mocker, or one of the makoros for the inyan of etzem ha'or? One of the famous makoros is one that Rebbe brought in the very first Maamar. Kodesh Yisrael Samach Vav, it's the end of Samach Vav, where the Rebbe Rashab goes into the three madregas lifnei atzimtzum, and he comes into etzem ha'or. Does he go before that a whole arichas about oir of l'mayla and ketz mata and tachlis as a hagdoma to this? He spoke about it earlier in the Hemshech, but that was somewhere else. It's miles away. This is at the end of the Hemshech. He goes into the madregas lifnei atzimtzum and he talks about etzem ha'or. You have to go through the whole arichas of l'mayla and ketz mata and tachlis in order to explain one madrega in l'mayla in lifnei atzimtzum. So obviously there's something he wants to say over here. So the nekuda is taka what the Rebbe is saying in this extra piece which seems a bit superfluous on page Lamed Zayin. The Mavai Bazer, the avoida of bizbus ha'otzros, there could be two types of melchama. If the melchama is negeh mamish, like netzach, then he'll be mevatzos the otzros. What is the nekuda over here? What happens when you're doing bizbus? What is bizbus ha'otzros? What is bizbus ha'otzros? What does that mean that the melech is going to be mevatzos the otzros? As opposed to what? As opposed to, that generally speaking, the melech has, should we say, two categories of belongings. He has things which everybody knows about, and he uses them every now and then. Everybody knows about it. And then there's hidden stuff which nobody knows about. It's hidden away in some treasure bank. When it comes to the milchama, which is negeh to etzem ha-nefesh, he's mevazvez the hidden stuff, the very expensive, the jewels, whatever it is over there, or the hidden weapons maybe. He's mevazvez it. He gives it over like it's cheap. He cheapens it. What does that mean, in other words? That beforehand, this was very, very choshev, and the other stuff, the regular stuff, is less choshev. So this everybody knows about, and this he gives out on a general basis. He gives this out. When it comes to bizbuz, what happens? They equalize. This may be important generally speaking, but now for me, or in this case, in the case of the king, when it's negeh to etzem ha-nefesh, they become equalized. They become bahashvo. That this choshev thing which is always hidden is as important as the other stuff, and the other stuff is as important. The golui and the nelam become equalized. Helem begila became beshova, and that's why he says. That's what he says in that one line at the end of page Lamed Vav. Umitzad ha'etzem beis kavim Elohim beshova. That's why he has to be magdim oirin sof l'maylo l'mato, because I don't know the inyan of hashva unless I know there's two kavim. I can't just go talking about there's a madregen oirin sof called etzem oirin, and that's the oitzer. That's not the vot to know just what the oitzer is. I want to know what bizbaz ha'oitzer is. What does it mean to be mevazvaz the oitzer? It means to equalize. To see the hashva between something which is nelam and something which is golui. So I have to know that there's two in Yanim and Oren Sof. There's Oren Sof which is begilu and there's Oren Sof which is behelam. And in this case, they are behashva. Where are they behashva? No, we're not talking about the way they're called in Atzmus. When they're obviously the one thing, the Yicholis, like we had in Topchen Chavov, the Yicholis is one and everything's one over there. We're talking about when they're on this gala, it's two different madregas in order. This is Oren Sof Lamayla and this is Oren Sof Lamata. This is the Oitza and this is not the Oitza. This is not the Oitza and Elam, it's Oren Sof Lamata. But when it comes to the Milcham of Bizbaz Oitzas, they become behashva. That's why it's negate to know the 2 points of Maila Mata. That will explain why the Rebbe goes into the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid. We know that the Oitzis is L'mayla Mayla Adichet. First of all, what does he say about the Magid and the Baal Shem Tov? He says the Baal Shem Tov is the inyan of L'mayla Mayla, and the Magid is the inyan of L'mata Mata. You saw that? It's fascinating. We've had Sichas in Sukkos that the Alter Rebbe is the inyan of Chachma. This Ushpiz, that Ushpiz, different spheres. What does it mean, different spheres? That means the Oifen that they were Megala, Teres HaChassidus, the Alter Rebbe was Megala in Oifen of Nekudas HaChochma. So he gave out Nekudas. The Mittel Rebbe, Harchovas Abir. One word of the Alter Rebbe becomes 3 pages. That's Bina. And each one has his Inyan. And the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, the Sichas say the Baal Shem Tov is Keneged Atik, because it was Baal Shem Skan Hoge, it was upgerukt, he was like Netak, didn't worry about Tevra Bechlal, he did what he did. And the Magid is somewhere in between, it's Arich, whatever that is. Here, they were saying that the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid is Atik and Arich, and he even asked the question, there's a shtukel over here, where he asked the question, what was it until now, Atik and Arich? Until the Baal Shem Tov came along. Look at the end of the Maamar, it says, they put it in a bracket, in a square bracket on page Mem, just before the end of Sif Dalad. Just before Sif Hey, there's a bracket. Usually when they put things in brackets, it means they're not quite sure where it belongs, or what was said. The Mashu Huva, the Inyan Atik Va'arich, Kfa Huva Bezoya, ובספר המקובל של אחר זה בקיס וליזו עד נץ חיים ושמיינו שעורים יש לב לזה דאף שזה הויה אויד לפני כסיבס תרס הבעל שם טוב וכל מוקם דווקא בספרים אלו נמשך זה בספיר ספוטיאס האורה number 40 קטע זה אין הבולו It's taka very not bolo. What when you tell me the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid is Atik and Arich. Where was Atik and Arich until now? Until they came along. Isn't that part of Seder Dach? So there's a piece missing, which you'll only see it if you go to the end of the Maamar. I'm doing very quickly because we'll come to the end now. If you look at the end of the Maamar, the Rebbe brings down at the end, where is it? V'ha'avoida, the last half of the paragraph. V'ha'avoida hi she'yeh dabel b'nei Yisrael v'Yisrael k'nimsa l'idei Moshe Rabbeinu atzmoi Shamar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Daven Shem Yisrael Shu inyan nitzcha ashach ata shoter nitzcha b'frat kol ma'aseh Moshe b'frat divrei Rosh. Oh, there. V'yuchad ha'ira shemosa Moshe HaKadosh Baruch Hu betul memutza ha'machaber k'mayim ha'neiche oimid bein Hashem u'v'neichem. So as I reingeschlungen again. They were just at the end of the Maamar. Memutza ha'machaber. That is the Nakuda. What does it mean that the Baal Shem Tov is Atik and the Magid is Arich? So say they're Shtarshus. What do you mean that they're Atik and Arich? It means that they are the Memutza HaMachaber, these Inyanim. And Memutza HaMachaber means just like Moshe Rabbeinu was Mechaber, Anoiche Oimid, Ben Hashem Elekechem B'nechem, Lahagid Lochem Estva Hashem, which means that he was a Memutza where the Hamshacha came through without filtering. And what does it mean it came through without filtering? It's like it says benegay to the Mutza of Torah, this we had in 9 base, remember it, that the Mamutza of Torah is different from a Mamutza of Seder Shtalshlus. A Mamutza of Seder Shtalshlus gives only a ha'ara. A Mamutza of Torah is a Hamshacha Atzmis. So this what Moshe Rabbeinu was a Mamutza Mechaber means it was a Hamshacha Atzmis. Shchina Medaberes Mitech Roinoi. So the same thing over here, this is what the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid were Atik and Arech means that they were able to be mamshich the atzmius of these madrigas. And that's why the Rebbe afterwards starts showing you how they did it in their Torah and in their Anhoga. You've got to learn the whole Maamar, so I'm just telling the Nekudas. You can remember that the Mamutza Mechaber says at the end of the Maamar is the yisoid of what he's saying up until now. That this what the Baal Shem to the Magid Atik and Arech, of course these are madrigas and the Shalshas. What does it mean the madrigas and the Shalshas? It's a ha'ara. One madriga to another madriga, this is a regular Seder Shtalshlus. We're talking about that they were a mamutza machaber, that they took the atzmius of these madrigas and they were able to bring it down. And the Rebbe brings examples in their Torah and in their Hanhoga. Let's just give an example of where you see the Baal Shem Tov brought down the union of Atik. The Rebbe brings down that he would go over, the Baal Shem Tov would go over to a simple person and say, "Was machst du?" And they would say, Baruch Hashem. The Rebbe says, Baruch Hashem, Ani mispalel da zatinik. He doesn't know what he's saying. He has no hasog in spheres or anything like that. He's talking about atzmas and mahus. And the Rebbe says, it's not even da zatinik. There's no das whatsoever. And that means that the Baal Shem Tov was bringing down an inyan which is netak completely from their das beflau. They don't even know what they're saying. It's just an amunah pshuta who was bringing it down to them. That means that madrega that the Baal Shem Tov had, which was Atik, he tried to bring it down to the simple person. They should also have this inyan by him, the inyan of amunah pshuta. You have to see it inside Ba'arichajay, so I'm just saying the Nekudas now. It's kedai to learn this Maamar Ba'imek. That's what it means about Shem Tov, the Magid are the Mamutza Mechaber. And how does that finish off with the Benegeh to the... okay, so that... you have to learn the Maamar to understand. What's up?
How does that connect to Eitzrus Kodesh from Hashva?
Because they were Megala the Eitzrus. It seems here that the Eitzrus are referring to the Eitzrus of Pnimis HaTorah, the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid were Megala. And here comes the Nakud, which I found very difficult. Why is he talking about the Magid? If the Oitz is the union of the Maida and Kates, which in spheres that would be Atik, so why is he talking about the Magid? He's talking about both of them together. The Vort is, we're going with the same Yisod that we said before. That Bizbaz or Oitzes means the Hashvah of Maila Mata. The Hashvah of the Behaltada and the Amplekta. Of the Inyanim which are Atik and which are Arich. They have to become Ba'ashvo. B'tzad Atzmusa, when he's mevazvez the Eitzrus, there's taka no difference, so they come down as one. So that Al Baal Shem to the Magid are one inyan which is Mechulik Nishtayim. Goes along the same idea we said before. Every oil has two, is the same thing. Atik and Arich are one inyan which is split into two, Ma'ilomata, which mean in Benegeh to the Eitzrus of Chassidus, is the Baal Shem to the Magid is one inyan which is split into two. And they are Ba'ashvo. And then through Rabbi Seder we understand a bit more because it's also explained in Chabad. But what is the Nakud? Why is he talking about the Magid? Because it's the Hashfor. You have to say he's talking about the Hashfor of both of them. That's why it's negate to explain both in Yon, both Baal Shem Tov and the Magid. That's it in a nutshell, but you've got to learn the Maamar inside.